Welcome to Double Trouble, Macdonald-Laurier Institute's new podcast series where we explore the implications of the emerging axis of authoritarianism between Russia and China for Canada, for our allies, friends, and the world. Double Trouble is generously supported by Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office. I'm your host, Dr. Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by my colleague and friend, Alex Dalziel, a senior fellow and the project lead for the National Security Program at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Today, we will be talking about Alex's recent paper that focuses on Russia-China cooperation in the Eurasian Arctic, which is a very important topic, which we don't necessarily think too much here in Canada. When we talk about the Arctic, we tend to focus on the North American Arctic, on Canadian Arctic, and our own naturally concerns about the safety and security and prosperity in our own north. But of course, the Eurasian Arctic is huge. It's economically extremely important, particularly for Russia and for naturally for our European allies, which we will get in a minute. And we will put a link in the description down for Alex's paper, but we can also find the paper if you go to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute's website. That's the first thing that will show up for you today, and we are recording on June 19th this episode. The paper is titled Eurasian North, the Geopolitics of Russia and China in the Arctic. Now, without further ado, let me just turn to Alex. And why don't you give our listeners an overview of what this project is part about? This is a larger project that you are engaged in, and let's start from there, and then we'll get to the specifics of the paper and why we need to think about and care about the Eurasian Arctic.
Yeah, thanks, Balkan, and thanks for having me on the podcast. It's great to have the opportunity to talk about this. So, looking at the Arctic, from a Canadian perspective, one of the things that I've felt has been missing in the discussion is a geopolitical treatment of the issues going on. Too often we think about the Arctic as kind of one big lump. We have some divisions, framing it often through the Arctic Council or through the Ilulissat Declaration, which was the 5 Arctic ocean states that have, quote, coasts on the Arctic Ocean. And sometimes we miss some of the dynamics that are taking place in the Arctic because of that lens. And we also need a lens that shows a little bit more about how, relationships are forming in terms of geopolitical blocks. So not necessarily institutionalized relationships or fully institutionalized relationships, but also between the different dynamics of cooperation and competition that exist there. So this paper, as you mentioned, on Russia and China and then their relationship in the Arctic, is the first of a 3-part series that tends to break the Arctic down into kind of 3 geopolitical chunks. There's other ways you can carve this up, but we felt this was the best way to get at some of the hard security and political and economic issues. So the second one will be on the Nordic Arctic, so basically concentrating on Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and looking at that lens. Again, an area that's changed a lot from a NATO perspective, and therefore is kind of a geopolitical sub-block almost within the West, within Europe and transatlantic space. Because of Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO. The final installment, or the third and final installment, will be on the North American Arctic. So Canada and the US, as we've become accustomed to think, but also Greenland, and therefore the Kingdom of Denmark, will also be a part in thinking about the particular attributes, assets, and challenges that we face there.
Oh, excellent. And I think it's sort of important to re-emphasize, and that's why you're doing this series as a three paper work to emphasize the differences when we're talking about the Arctic, and it's a huge area, right? And challenges are different. For example, when we're talking mostly about the North American Arctic, we're talking about a maritime space, maybe undersea as well as space components. But when we're talking about the European High North, for example, with Finland and Norway, we're really talking about the land component when it comes to security issues, etc. And of course, the Eurasian Arctic combines them both. That there are maritime components, but there is a significant natural resource component. There is a significant land component that we need to be thinking about it. So it is important, as the famous saying goes, geography is destiny. So we need to sort of really place this in a very concrete way of how these things work, rather than some sort of ethereal institutional map without paying much attention to the realities, the actual physical realities on the ground. So let's dive into the paper. Just so, we don't want to give away too much so people can
Right.
the details, but let's tease out a little bit of the central arguments that you're making. If you have to sort of highlight, if people are watching this and they just want to take a minute out of this, and we'll come back to this later on, what is the central argument that you're making in this particular paper?
Yeah, well, the real core of the argument is that, for Russia, the Arctic has become really an essential component of how it's responding to changes in the international system, largely induced by its choice to conduct a full invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And, the Arctic becomes one of the pivotal components in getting to markets for energy, for other commodities in the Asia Pacific and in East Asia and China in particular. For China, it's also a geopolitical story and has to do with the deterioration of relations with all the other Arctic countries, where primarily for geoeconomic reasons, China has largely been thwarted from developing the quote unquote polar Silk Road and some of these initiatives. So China, perceiving itself as a global power, believes it has to have a polar strategy for both Antarctica and for the Arctic. And if you're talking about the North Pole, then that means Russia is really the only option it has to have a more fully expressed relationship cutting across economics, investment, different aspects there, natural resources, etc., as well as political. And that element is also very important to be seen to be active in this part of the world. So that's kind of I would say the core couple of points in a minute, and we can expand around some of the other breakout points on that. But that's really it. They're their best available options to develop and remain present in the Arctic and have varying degrees of northern polar power.
Let's before we start drilling into the specific of the Russia and China component, I think there's quite an interesting number of things about the increasing dependence on each other, and especially if something goes down in the South China Sea. The Eastern Seaway might very well be the only way for the Chinese, for example, to get their goods out and get things in, and etc. So it's going to be a quite interesting thing to explore. I want to drill that down into it, but maybe for the listeners who are not particularly conversant in the geography of the Eurasian Arctic, Eurasian North, could you give people a sense of what makes it unique? What is the difference between the Eurasian North and the North American route on the one hand, and then following from that, why it matters really for Russia? What is the key component? And we know, but let's sort of make it much more explicit why it is important for Russia, the Arctic component.
So, there's a few basic points of differentiation if you're going to compare the Eurasian Arctic with the North American Arctic. First is that population dynamics are considerably different. Russia has some of the biggest population centers in the Arctic, dating back to Soviet times. And Russia's really historically had a deep engagement with its Arctic, whether you think of the Second World War and convoys coming to Murmansk in Russia's west, or in general, just historically, it was one of the kind of windows to access the Western Europe and beyond. In terms of environmental and climatological sort of factors, the environment there is changing quickly, as the Arctic is the most rapid climate change that we're seeing. Some of the kind of factors in how ice forms and moves actually means that ice is kind of clearing out of the north of Russia at a better, faster rate than it is from the North American Arctic, which, notably large portion of which is a archipelago of islands, a big network of islands that kind of where sea ice can form more easily and jam up. So that is allowing a degree of more maritime access. So I think that those are kind of two of the major differences you would see. And of course, there's other factors in the sense that, because this is so much more part of Russian consciousness of its strategic position, that it's got a considerable head start in developing different aspects, not just military, but also ports, its icebreaker fleet, some of the core infrastructure that you need to operate in the Arctic. So Russia's ahead of the curve when it comes to those things. Now, from China's perspective, China's not an Arctic country. It did in its Arctic policy white paper in 2017 identify itself as a quote unquote near Arctic state. That has really no status with anyone.
I mean, we are here in Canada, probably near African state or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, what's near is the Eurasian landmass. And that's where I think this perspective of looking at that, kind of inspired in one sense by, Mackinder and some of these early views. But there is, the fact that they share border, they share space, and there's a continuity of territory across that landmass between China's northern border and then when the Arctic really starts to exist, thousands of kilometers further to the north. So there is a kind of basic interconnectivity that's there. But it really is the maritime realm that is allowing the connectivity and, is a more, how would I say, flexible means to develop that part of the relationship. And again, we can dive into that a little more in depth.
No, excellent. I mean, I think just to recap, the demographics and the climate components are quite different. Basically, Eurasian Arctic, in that sense, there are a lot more people, and as a result, there is more infrastructure, and things seems to be getting easier to move around in the Eurasian Arctic compared to Canada and the North American Arctic, where climate change doesn't mean that it's get easier. It might actually get harder and more treacherous to move in the Canadian Arctic, as well as we don't even have the population even comparable to it. Just to give, I think, a clear number to people, across 3 territories, I think we have about 150,000 people living in the Canadian Arctic. The Russians have about 4 million population.
It's probably a bit on the high end, but certainly Murmansk, hundreds of thousands of people, Norilsk. I mean, there's a number of places that really there's no comparison even in the Nordic Arctic, in terms of Tromsø and some of these places. I mean, you're talking tens of thousands. So yeah, they do have some very large and developed centers that put the population. I mean, I believe in Soviet times Murmansk was only like 1 million people.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's probably dropped.
It is a big space, right? And a lot of people there, and commensurate infrastructure to go with it. So I think it's sort of important to understand the difference.
But you said something important there, which is the harshness of the environment. So that does need to be kept in mind. That we're talking here that access is improving, and I think that's it's clearly improved. This year is already looking to be a kind of set records in terms of the amount of shipping, et cetera, that will go through the sea lanes north of Russia. But this remains a very treacherous environment. And in fact, the ability to navigate it, before you couldn't navigate for large chunks of the year or maybe at all, some parts of it. Now you can, but that doesn't mean it's easy or convenient in the sense that you won't encounter obstacles. And I think that's an important, even in the Russian Arctic, to keep in mind that this is a very difficult operating environment.
Yeah, and this is not a pleasure cruise in the Caribbean. People sort of need to get that, I think, clearly in the mind that this remains a very hostile environment. Operationally speaking, it's very, very tough to do things, even if when you have like the Russians coming from the Soviet experience, have infrastructure and the knowledge and the capabilities to deal with it. So it is not going to be, regardless of what people think, you're not going to see, at least in the very near future, 5, 10 years or 15 years down the road, you're not going to see, traffic jams in a way that you might end up seeing, say, in Suez Canal, because it's a super hostile environment to operate. Anything getting in and getting out is very expensive, right? So that's something to keep in mind. I want to switch to, as we get to sort of the specific dynamics of Russia, China, and the Eurasian Arctic, and what that means for us and for the rest of the world. Before we drill into that one, maybe just give an idea about why this is important for Russia, right? You highlighted,
Yes.
aspects of it, economically why it matters, militarily why it matters, etc., etc. And then I think we can link it from there and how that is relevant for Russia-China relationship and beyond.
So if we look at the disaster that is Russia's relations with Europe and with the Euro-Atlantic community and its closest partners, Russia has put itself in a very difficult position in that the majority of its trade with in natural gas in particular, but in energy more generally, was with Europe. And that we've really seen since 2022, the end of the piped natural gas industry from Russia to Europe. So this has entailed a massive effort. Maybe massive is not quite the right word, but a very urgent effort on the part of the Russians to find alternative markets and reship this. Now, one little nuance here is that liquefied natural gas carried by ships is still flowing rather merrily between Russia and Europe. So this aspect of the trade is still there. But again, it was a very small component compared to the amount that was being piped in through the Baltic Sea and through Ukraine, etc. So that's pretty negligible now. And all that depends on infrastructure in the way, say, that oil doesn't, right? I mean, oil, yeah, you can put it in a pipeline, but you can also put it in a tanker and that can move and you can change markets and it's very flexible. So you've seen a large shift in oil, being sold at discount prices, not just to China, but to India. So again, a shift to the Pacific and Indian Oceans for markets for that. Natural gas, though, is a bigger challenge for these reasons. So, in the next, decade or so, I mean, shipping will be the major component for getting that to Asian markets. I mean, the other part here is that, to evade sanctions and find circumventions to get some of the technology it needs to continue to wage war in Ukraine has largely been coming through different parts of Asia and China, while the jury's still out on whether they're going to provide full-on arms to Russia. They certainly are keeping the Russian arms machine going through lots of more medium-sized enterprises that are finding ways to work around the risks of sanctions to get products through, and probably, well, I don't say probably about it, with kind of a informed ignorance from the leadership about what's going on. So, they become a major supporter for Russia in that sense. So we see kind of both the geopolitical ties, core Russian needs can only be met now through Asian options in many cases. So this really puts them in a position where, the Northern Sea Route, which is the name of the sea lane that runs across the north of Russia, becomes a very important aspect to get to these markets, to actually accomplish the pivot. So in that sense, the Arctic is being integrated into Russian geopolitics in a way that simply we're not seeing in other parts of the Arctic.
I want to stay with that one because while working on this paper, you have been through a lot of the Russian documents and their thinking and strategic documents about the Arctic, and we do see. I mean, there's always been a part of it, but especially in the last number of strategic documents, be it the maritime strategy or the national security components that are coming out in the past few years. you see a very significant emphasis on the Arctic, which was not necessarily there before. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of strategic mindset shift about the Arctic? And then I want to really drill into what is in it for China and what they're trying to achieve.
Absolutely, Balkan. Yeah. So, I mean, again, you're right to put this in a larger long-term frame, and certainly during the Soviet Union, the Arctic played a big role in Soviet national security. What we really saw was a lull in the 1990s, as with so many things, when Russia was in a state of upheaval after the collapse of the Soviet Union and its failed attempt to become a democracy and market economy. So, Putin, basically from the Putin era on, we've seen, re-attention to the Arctic as an important piece. So in their strategic documents over the last 2 decades, the Arctic always features, but what we've seen is kind of a prioritization go up where the Arctic is seen as the primary maritime domain, even outranking, the Pacific and the Atlantic. They call it a vital interest. I mean, the Black Sea and a couple of other smaller bodies of water get that attention, but the Arctic is really at the forefront of this, and an increasing assertiveness around not just the Northern Sea route as a sovereign seaway, which is an argument they have with many. Under international law, just as Canada does over the Northwest Passage, I mean, whether this constitutes an international waterway or national waters. But more broadly on the continental shelf, the last couple of documents, and now I think we've seen rhetorically accompanying these documents, a greater push to assert what rights Russia can capture under international law, sovereign rights to resources on the seabed. And, again, as I've written elsewhere, international law here doesn't really suggest this means playing nice. I mean, it does suggest there's something of a framework, but, the accompanying kind of all of government, all of society push to justify these things is something we need to keep in mind over a slightly longer time horizon, I think, than what, this paper covered, because the central Arctic Ocean, where most of this is going to be icebound, or at least, again, very hostile for probably another 50 to 75 years, but nonetheless, frankly, like Norway and like the United States, Russia has been trying to stake its claim, and the accompanying rhetoric is very kind of aggressive, frankly making it sound like there's a threat that isn't really there, to be honest, with some of this. So the rhetorical posturing is already there. So I think we've seen that component as gain more attention, and again, the pivot to Asia that Russia's been trying to do. I mean, this predates even 2014 with the initial invasion of Ukraine, but the importance of that, then it could kind of be something that you would develop longer term to kind of complement, or longer term growth as the European market changed. Now it's really been forced upon them to accentuate this. So it's really, when you think about melting permafrost and just even, and we can get into this now when we start talking about China, what are some of China's limits in terms of what it's willing to do with Russia and how that frames it? The maritime routes really remain, or how would I put it, are going to be accentuated as the way to make this relationship work over the next decade.
No, I think I want to drill on that. Just want to make one point, and that is just for the listeners to be aware that the important component of Russia's nuclear forces are also, of course, in the North, right? So that is a very important part of it, and they do have a vast network of military installations and bases and infrastructure that they actually continue to invest in and did invest in heavily in the past years, and modernize them, so on and so forth. So we're really looking at a place where they will continue to put more emphasis on their nuclear forces, especially as they withdraw their land forces, like from bases near Finland and other places, and send them down to Ukraine. They will be increasingly relying on their strategic forces that are based in there. So there is a key military component to the Russian thinking about this, and a broader Russian security aspect of it.
notably, a lot of that infrastructure is right next to Norway and Finland, so that does create that kind of one interface pressure point that lines up with the Baltic Sea as well. Yeah, I think that
is the second paper. So those people should need to wait for that one.
They're responding. They're looking at that one. So that's I mean, I just add maybe to that point that the Russian. So the Soviet and Russian Arctic, I mean, again, for military thinking, like you say, it's been part of the whole strategic nuclear capacity. One of the things I think we're seeing more in general is that the Arctic is not just a place, as Dr. Whitney Lackenbauer talks about, it's a place where threats can come. They're in, they're through, they're to. For a long time, the Arctic was seen primarily as kind of a phase that you use to pass through to reach, larger population centers wherever they might be. If you're looking at North America, further to the south, increasingly there's the need to draw attention to the fact that some things, some security threats are actually manifesting in the Arctic, about the Arctic, and territory there. So, Russia has done a lot to shore up its position in the Arctic. Still a lot to go because this is a huge space, but they're definitely far ahead on this question of putting in assets that can advance the bigger strategic goals, but also potentially can advance more regional interests, whether that be in Europe or elsewhere. And again, I think this attention to the Arctic Ocean and its seabed and the delimitation of the continental shelf is part of that in the thinking. And it's important to keep in mind that for us to respond to this, I mean, the time horizons are long. You need to build assets that can operate in this environment, icebreakers, drones, etc. So strategic, advanced strategic thinking is warranted, on timelines that maybe are not the same if you're thinking about certainly Ukraine, where you have to think about it from week to week, but even more generally about the European, say Russia, the NATO Russia sort of contact line.
No, I think that's super important. I mean, there is no Amazon next day delivery when it comes to dealing with the Arctic, right? So we need.
Maybe I'll make one more point on this if I could too, Balkan, because the Russians will often bring up this issue of militarizing in the Arctic, which is a red herring, right? I mean, to deflect from what they're doing, and try to put the onus on others to explain themselves. Russia, when you read all these strategic documents, military force is completely embedded in how they think about international relations. I mean, they're not unique in this aspect, but, there's a lot of language in there that can be used to justify all kinds of asymmetric, efforts, whether those are diplomatic or sabotage kinetic, as the military likes to call it, type things. So, again, it's a case where we need to read what the Russians are saying about this stuff. I mean, they're telling us in many cases what to, sometimes you got to read a little bit between the lines and obviously understand some of the background. But, there's not really any mystery here that they see the Arctic as a place where, just as any other space on the planet, military power exists and needs to be managed. And is to some extent this kind of talk about militarization again as an information operation, a high level line to try to create doubt in other parts that increasing their military capabilities in the Arctic is somehow completely off limits and will antagonize Russia. I mean, if that were the case, they've been antagonizing us for the better part of two decades. So there's always a need for thinking about calibration, etc., for sure. But I mean, that's an interesting part of their rhetorical kind of armory that they like to break out when in fact they're the ones that have been taking leaps and strides when it comes to strengthening their military capacities in the north.
No, I think that's super important. I mean, it's also part of a broader Russian statecraft in terms of reflexive control, right? The idea is to you shape the narrative and the frame of discussion in a way that whatever the choices the other party does actually advances your interests, not their own. And I think they really sort of leveraged this sort of misguided notion, I would say, of Arctic exceptionalism, and somehow this is divorced or from the broader geopolitical challenges, where military force and use of force, or the threat of use of force, is a core component of any statecraft, and thinking that somehow Arctic is outside of this and not necessarily being touched upon was very much misguided. And I think even those who were advocating at one point come to realize that that's just not the case. We should not be sort of fall into the rhetorical traps that the Russians are setting us up for, and push back for that reflexive control. I want to switch to as we're coming towards the end here, more explicitly on the China component and what is in it for China, right? I mean, we call the podcast is Double Trouble. And the whole idea is to talk about how these powers work in tandem. Sometimes cooperation, sometimes there's a conflict and tension, as we see also within the Arctic part of it. But let's start with what is in it for China when it comes to the thinking about the Eurasian North, and you highlighted the maritime component very significantly. So could you drill down on a little bit what they're hoping to get, why they are, what's in it for China to work with Russia on this one?
So I think there's a number of things. Again, they're the only option, as I started off, for them to kind of do a lot of different stuff. So the transit, again, is big because, China, to get to markets in Europe and in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic Ocean in general, has to run through, some choke points, some that are, subject to quite a bit of lawlessness at times, piracy, organized crime, terrorism, other things like that, Straits of Malacca in Southeast Asia, as we've seen in the Red Sea with what's going on with the Houthis and shipping. These are places through which an awful lot of cargo and data as well from the subsea cables flows through. So, and then alternatively, there's also the Suez Canal on the other side, which is facing challenges around climate change because of some of its sources of water that it uses to move ships between the two oceans are drying up, some of the lakes, etc. So, there's these challenges that, China really wants to diversify how it can reach markets. So, the Northern Sea Route is one of these options that, certainly short of war with the United States, provides, other flexibility for China to get to where it wants to get. In optimal sailing conditions, it's like 4,000 kilometers shorter as well from, points in eastern China to Europe. So, again, in optimal sailing conditions, which, generally don't apply, but are still there, you can save fuel, you can save money, you can save time. So that's a primary interest there. You also need to keep in mind that, China, when it comes to international position and prestige, believes it's a global player and that it should have impact and presence everywhere. So for now, given that the opportunities in northern North America or Northern Europe are more limited for science, for just activity, whether it's economic, etc. Russia is really the only game in town, and this is important for them. I mean, this is important for them to be seen this way. They emphasize that through talking about climate change, etc., and that the Arctic can't only be for the Arctic countries, etc. So again, they don't really have the capabilities yet. I mean, they have some in terms of ice breaking, but maintain an independent presence there, and it may not actually be in their interests to want to do that yet. I would say also another factor here that's useful for them, again, is kind of looking at this Eurasian lens. So, we didn't talk about it much so far, but much of Russia is a mineral superpower in terms of its mining, kind of geological deposits, etc. I mean, China dominates in these strategic minerals, critical minerals, rare earth elements. I mean, not only in terms of processing, which they completely dominate, like 90-something%, they also have huge reserves of this in their own geology. So by having this relationship with Russia, which is the second biggest when it comes to rare earth elements and critical minerals, it really creates a very powerful bloc where China has at least some say or some ability to influence how that enters the global market. And
we're effectively looking at a duopoly. I mean, if you think about it, essentially.
Yeah. So the question here, I think, and it starts to get into, these are some of these are the convergences, as I talk about in the paper, that I think can't be underestimated. And the last one I would mention in that space is that there does still seem to be some lingering view that the China-Russia relationship is always kind of on the edge of breaking down. There's these tensions on the border. Historically, there's these grievances, etc. Like, their border's been settled now for well over a decade. Some of the demographic concerns have really ebbed in Russia, in terms of, massive Chinese migration to places that were formerly part of the Chinese Empire, etc. Like, since 2022, as people like Alexander Gaviev at Carnegie talk about, there's been a massive change in the Russian mentality towards China writ large. So I think that, while these factors are true historically, and while, neither side here is doing any of this out of like enlightened altruistic cooperation.
There is no love between them, that is for sure. Yes,
you can be sure they don't trust each other broadly, but they work together. Much like Russia and Turkey and others. Like, again, this is a mistake to assume that just because they don't trust each other, they can't cooperate. So, in fact, I think the burden of evidence is on the fact that barring really a change in either one of this relationship with the United States, that's the factor. Right. That's the factor that keeps the glue in this relationship, whether it's the Arctic or anything else that we're talking about. So, if you look at some of the aggressive things they would have to do to upset this, like Russia just kind of blanketly refusing Chinese shipping coming through, China forcing its way without asking for permission to sail the Northern Sea route, some other breach that just seems completely implausible. And, again, we should always be ready to be surprised, but this would definitely rank up high on the surprise chain when they're getting what they want.
Absolutely. It's key, I think, for people to sort of understand that they might not necessarily be in love with each other, but that does not necessarily prevent them from working together, because what unites them, which is sort of this being against and trying to undermine the existing order, as well as what they perceive as the primary enemy, that is United States and the West broadly speaking, is much stronger than whatever the minor grievances they might have. And that in the sequencing of things matter, right? These fissures, these rifts may become more important down the road in 40 years. But there are very serious concerns that really unite them for the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years.
Let me sum this up, right? Their border being secure is a major geopolitical asset for both sides. It allows Russia to focus on the West, China to focus on the East. Like, this part cannot be underestimated. If your primary rival is outside of that space, that's a huge, huge deal, of which the Arctic is a part of that.
Exactly. That has always been, again, when you think about the way that the Russians geopolitically think, it's the two-front component of it. So they secure their East so that they can focus their aggression on the West. So I think, the sequencing thing is important. Whenever people bring about what about these differences or clash of interest between Russia and China, I always highlight that, look, that might be a problem in 50 years down the road. That's not their concern right now, right? Sequencing does matter. You don't put your shoes before you put your socks on. It is about how to prioritize, and there's a very clear convergence of interests here, and that's why
there's a big pragmatic space between the points of principle that they disagree on, and these are over the status of the Central Arctic Ocean. The Chinese emphasize more this is an international space, which, again, international law, some of this is just kind of a rhetorical shaping exercise, because international law frames most of this. And it looks like, for the most part, even what they're saying is consistent with parts of this. They disagree over the ultimate status of this Northern Sea route, as I've mentioned. Again, would they force that issue? These are points of principle that can kind of be put aside for this pragmatic space. Now, what I do think is interesting to talk about is, what the limits are within that now. And we see some of this from China, and that China, as much as it probably is in its interest now to see Russia not fail in Ukraine, I think this is a key part of what's going on. There's no benefit for them seeing Russia lose, and then what are the political ramifications of that? Upheaval. You lose the devil, who's kind of in charge. So we do see, and there's also China has its own energy security objectives, mixing together renewables with coal, etc., to create more autonomy for itself, so it's less dependent on external sources of energy. China does not want to give Russia kind of any trump cards, here in that relationship. So, they are doing things like slow walking, expanding another oil pipeline, rail, et cetera, is growing, but, it's slower. In general, a lot of these terrestrial links that cause more investment and are kind of completely bipolar, if you would, between 2 points, as opposed to investing in shipping, which, probably want to have some ice class and some specialized things, but that's not necessarily limited to using it in the Arctic. So there's a bit of a lesser investment. And we see some aspects of the Russians being pushed by the Chinese into Central Asia to kind of come through there, where, again, Chinese dependency is maybe higher on countries that it can have more influence over, Kazakhstan, some of the Central Asian republics. So, again, for instance, none of this is altruistic, right? The Chinese are playing for the best possible deal. For them, the best possible deal is Russia, maybe not winning with its maximal aims in Ukraine. I think they're kind of probably indifferent to some extent on this. Maybe not indifferent, but certainly they don't want to see a completely discredited Russian system that's thrown into upheaval.
I mean, and like I think pointed out, it's what really unites them is much stronger than these other irritants. We're coming towards the end here. I want to sort of wrap up by asking about why Canada needs to pay attention to this, right? Yes, Arctic is important for us, etc., but in a broader geopolitical sense, why Canada and the Canadians need to pay attention to the cooperation between Russia and China in the Eurasian Arctic?
Mm-hmm. Well, China's effectively going to be keeping Russia in the Arctic game and accentuating their game, right? So if you look at the highest level here, I think North America needs to be ready to think about how we work with our partners in the transatlantic space about responding to this. And some of this is about trade and making sure our Arctic regions have economic development opportunities, et cetera. But it is also just thinking, more creatively from kind of a top-down look at the world about the fact that they're going to be projecting power, projecting capability in that space, and what are the costs, right? And certainly as you build capability that can apply there, it can apply somewhere else. And so to that extent, it's really China's, as with all of this, China's support for Russia is keeping, Russia in the game, and in this case, potentially strengthening it. Also, by giving China more ins, again, in a longer term perspective, increases its attractiveness to compete for investment, et cetera, in everywhere, north of our country, Greenland, Alaska, north of Scandinavia, certainly Iceland, Svalbard, all these different islands, Faroe Islands, etc. It really increases that. So there's a basic capability issue here that I think, it's not necessarily you need to think about offense, but, having a really good institutional defense kind of on this side, making sure these places, northern locations we have an extremely strong game when it comes to offering the technologies, the services, et cetera. So I think this is a very broad geoeconomic, geopolitical emphasis going on. Canada, for one, needs to build up its capabilities. And that's, again, ice breaking and things, not just military. It's observational, it's awareness things. So I think that's the deep significance that, if we see this area becoming more and more important to their relationship, we at least need to think hard about, what we need to do to make sure that, we have kind of the right political, economic response.
No, I think that's very important. And just to riff off of the title of the recent DPU, Defense Policy Update, if we want our North to be strong and free, we really need to be paying attention to what's going on in other people's North and think about the implications of it. Well, Alex, thank you very much for coming on the Double Triple. This is going to be a wrap for us for this episode. Just to remind you guys that the paper is Eurasian North, the Geopolitics of Russia and China in the Arctic. It's you can go and enjoy much more detailed aspects of what we discussed today, and more to come on this subject from Alex. And when those papers are out, we will have him back here to talk on the implications of those developments for the North American Arctic and the European High North. Double Trouble is generously supported by the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation's Canada office, and we are very thankful for their support. And until next time, this is it for us from the Double Trouble.